The smell of garlic hitting olive oil at 6 in the morning. A kitchen so small 2 people couldn't pass without touching shoulders. Somewhere in Newark, 1932, a woman is cooking something the Italian government tried to ban. 20 of these recipes once filled Sunday tables from Brooklyn to South Philly. Number 14 got a grocer arrested in Naples. Number 7 technically violated a trade law nobody enforced. But here is the strange part. These dishes survived not because Italy protected them. They survived because families left. And the question nobody in those families thought to ask until it was too late is what happens when an entire generation's cooking disappears and nobody writes it down. If you are watching this and you have ever stood in a kitchen trying to remember how your grandmother made something and you could not, this list is for you. Subscribe because we cover stories like this every week, and this one starts with bread. Number 20, pane di grano misto, mixed grain bread. In 1902, Italy's food purity statutes required commercial bread to be made from a single classified grain, wheat or nothing. The law was designed to prevent millers from cutting expensive flour with cheaper grains like rye, farro, or chestnut flour to increase their profit margins. A baker in Calabria caught selling mixed grain loaves could be fined and shut down. But in the hill towns south of Cosenza, families had been baking bread with whatever grain they could grow for centuries. Chestnut trees were everywhere. Farro grew in poor soil. A loaf made from 3 grains was not fraud. It was Tuesday. When those families reached American ports, they kept baking the way they always had. A grandmother in Hoboken in 1921 would have mixed chestnut flour into her wheat dough without thinking twice. She was not making a statement. She was making bread. The Italian government had a word for that bread. The word was adulterated. She had a different word, breakfast. That bread fed a household of 9 for 2 cents a loaf. The law that banned it never crossed the ocean. The recipe did. Number 19, sanguinaccio dolce, sweet blood pudding, made from fresh pig's blood, dark chocolate, sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes pine nuts. In parts of Campania, this was a carnival tradition, rich and dark, and served cold in small cups. Italy banned the sale of raw pig's blood for culinary use in 1992 under EU food safety directives, but the dish had been falling out of favour in Italian cities since the 1960s, when refrigeration and commercial chocolate made the old preparation seem primitive. In Italian-American households from Philadelphia to Providence, grandmothers were still making sanguinaccio into the 1980s. A woman on Federal Hill in Providence would send her husband to the butcher on a Saturday morning. He would come back with a jar of blood wrapped in newspaper. By Sunday afternoon, the pudding was set, and children who had no idea what was in it would eat it with a spoon and ask for more. The dish did not disappear because anyone banned it in America. It disappeared because the generation that knew the butcher died, and their children did not know to ask. Number 18, pasta con lessard with wild fennel. In Sicily, this was a fisherman's wife's dish. Sardines, wild fennel fronds, pine nuts, currants, saffron, and pasta. The wild fennel was the problem. Italian agricultural regulations in several provinces classified the foraging of wild herbs from public and roadside land as a grey area, sometimes fined, sometimes ignored. The fennel grew everywhere and cost nothing, which meant no one could tax it and no merchant could control its supply. Sicilian women who came to New York in the 1910s and 1920s would hunt for wild fennel in empty lots and along railroad tracks in Brooklyn and Queens. They knew the plant by sight and by smell. They could tell you which patch grew bitter and which grew sweet. The dish depended entirely on finding that fennel, and for decades they found it. Then the lots got paved, the railroad edges got sprayed with chemicals, and the daughters who never learned to identify the plant in the wild started buying the bulb fennel from the grocery store, which is a different plant entirely. The dish survived in name, the flavour did not. Number 17. Ricotta salata fatta in casa. Homemade salted ricotta, pressed and aged in cloth for weeks on a kitchen shelf. Italian food safety laws progressively tightened requirements on cheese aging environments through the mid-20th century. And by the 1960s, producing aged cheese outside of a licensed facility was technically a violation in many regions. The regulations targeted commercial fraud, not grandmothers. But the law did not make that distinction on paper. In America, Italian grandmothers pressed ricotta in cheesecloth, salted it, and hung it from a nail in the pantry. The cheese would dry and harden over 2 or 3 weeks, developing a sharp, crumbly texture that no store-bought version has ever matched. The kitchen smelled like salt and milk for days. Nobody complained. The last generation to make this at home understood something about patience that the grocery store made unnecessary. You could buy ricotta salata wrapped in plastic, but it did not taste like the one your grandmother hung from a nail. It never will. First pattern break. Italy's food laws were never really about food. They were about control. After unification in 1861, the Italian government inherited a peninsula of wildly different food cultures, dialects, and agricultural economies. Standardizing food was part of standardizing the nation. You could not build one Italy if Calabria was eating bread made from 3 grains, while Lombardy insisted on one. You could not regulate commerce if every village had its own cheese aged on a kitchen shelf. The laws worked. They standardized Italian food into the version we now recognize on restaurant menus and in cookbooks. But the old food, the food that came before the laws, the food that was too regional, too poor, too improvised to survive regulation, that food went underground. And when the people who cooked it left for America, they carried it in their hands and in their heads, and they kept making it in kitchens that no Italian inspector would ever see. The regulations ate the old traditions, and immigration accidentally saved them. Number 16. Conserva di pomodoro al sole, sun-dried tomato conserve, made by spreading tomato paste on wooden boards in the August sun and letting it dry for days, then rolling it into balls or packing it into jars under olive oil. Italian hygiene regulations in the post-war period increasingly restricted open-air food processing, and by the 1970s, producing tomato conserve on outdoor boards violated sanitary codes in most regions. On rooftops and fire escapes in South Philadelphia, Italian grandmothers were still laying out tomato boards in August well into the 1980s. The paste would darken in the sun, concentrating into something so intense that a single spoonful could season a pot of sauce for a family of 8. Neighbors would see the red boards and know the season. Children would be warned not to touch them. Flies were swatted, pigeons were chased. The practice required 3 things: sun, space, and time. Apartments got smaller, backyards vanished, and the women who knew exactly when the conserve was ready, who could tell by color and texture and the way it pulled from the board, they aged out of their kitchens one by one. Number 15. Mostarda di frutta, fruit mustard. A condiment made by simmering candied fruits in a mustard oil syrup. The mustard oil was the issue. Italy placed restrictions on the production and sale of mustard oil due to its erucic acid content, and several EU regulations later tightened those controls. The traditional preparation used raw mustard essence that could blister skin and make your eyes water. Italian-American families who made mostarda at home used the old-strength mustard oil that could strip paint. They served it alongside boiled meats on Sundays, and the heat of the mustard against the sweetness of the fruit was the whole point. A grandmother in Utica, New York, kept a jar of mustard oil in the back of her cabinet that her granddaughter thought was furniture polish. The commercial versions sold in stores today use a diluted mustard flavoring. They taste like candy. The original tasted like a dare. It was supposed to. Number 14. Lardo stagionato, cured lard. Not rendered cooking fat, but a slab of pork back fat cured in marble troughs with salt, rosemary, garlic and black pepper for 6 months or longer. The most famous version comes from Colonnata, a marble quarrying town in Tuscany, where the curing troughs were carved from the same stone Michelangelo used. In 1996, EU food safety regulations nearly destroyed Lardo di Colonnata entirely. The marble troughs did not meet hygiene standards designed for stainless steel facilities. Producers were threatened with shutdown. A grocer in Naples who sold unregulated cured lard from a small producer could face fines. In American kitchens, Italian grandmothers cured their own lardo in ceramic crocks and wooden boxes. The fat would turn silky and translucent, and they would slice it thin and lay it on warm bread. A single slice dissolved on the tongue. The salt hit first, then the rosemary, then something sweet and clean that was just the fat itself, transformed by time. The EU eventually granted Lardo di Colonnata protected status in 2004, but by then, most American Italian families had stopped making it. Lard became a word people were embarrassed by. The recipe waited in silence. Number 13. Vino cotto, cooked wine. Not wine reduced into a sauce, but grape must simmered for hours until it became a thick, dark syrup used as a sweetener, a condiment, and a medicine. In parts of Abruzzo and Molise, this was the only sweetener a poor family could afford. Sugar was expensive. Grapes grew on every hillside. Italian wine regulations classified grape must as a controlled product, and the production of cooked wine outside of licensed facilities fell into a regulatory grey zone that tightened steadily after the war. You could make it at home, you could not sell it, and if your neighbour reported you, a local inspector could confiscate your supply. In Trenton, New Jersey, a family from Abruzzo kept vino cotto in recycled wine bottles in their basement. The grandmother drizzled it over ricotta, poured it into dessert dough, and gave spoonfuls to children with sore throats. She called it medicine. A pharmacist would have called it unregulated. A food chemist would have called it extraordinary, a complex syrup with depth that balsamic vinegar imitates but never matches. She died in 1987. Her children found 12 bottles in the basement. They poured them out. Number 12. Supply al telefono made with raw egg. Roman rice croquettes stuffed with mozzarella. When you pull one apart, the cheese stretches into a long string like a telephone cord. The dish itself was never illegal, but the preparation method used in home kitchens violated food safety guidelines that prohibited serving rice dishes with raw or undercooked egg binding in commercial settings. At home, nobody cared. A Roman grandmother would mix day-old risotto with a raw egg, form it around a cube of mozzarella, and fry it in olive oil so hot the kitchen windows fogged. The egg bound the rice into a shell that cracked when you bit into it, and the molten cheese inside was hot enough to burn your mouth if you were not patient. Nobody in that kitchen was patient. The commercial version uses a different binding. It works, but the texture is wrong. Second pattern break. There is a paradox at the center of every recipe on this list. The laws that made these dishes illegal were, in most cases, reasonable. Food safety matters. Hygiene standards save lives. Regulating raw blood and curing fat in marble troughs and drying tomatoes in open air are not the acts of a tyrannical government. They are the acts of a modernizing one. But modernization, by definition, replaces the old with the new. And the old, in this case, was not just a method. It was a relationship between a woman and her kitchen, between a family and its land, between a region and its identity. The laws did not set out to erase that. They just measured everything in bacteria counts and temperature controls and forgot to measure what was lost. The recipes that survived were the ones that crossed an ocean before the inspectors arrived. Number 11. Cicoli Napolitani, Neapolitan pork cracklings, the leftover crispy bits from rendering lard, pressed into cakes or eaten warm with bread. The production of cicoli in unlicensed home settings was restricted under the same post-war hygiene regulations that targeted lardo and blood sausage. The reasoning was the same. Pork fat processed at home could harbor bacteria. The fact that families had been doing it safely for generations did not appear in the legislation. In Brooklyn, a father coming home from a 12-hour shift at the Navy Yard would find Sicoli wrapped in brown paper on the kitchen table. His wife had rendered the fat that morning. The cracklings were still warm, still salty, still perfect with a piece of bread and a glass of wine. He would eat standing up because he was too tired to sit and too hungry to wait. That meal cost almost nothing. The pork fat was the cheapest cut at the butcher. The bread was yesterday's loaf, but the labor was ours, standing over a pot, stirring, watching the fat slowly give up its cracklings like a confession. Number 10. Formaggio marcio, rotten cheese. Specifically, Casu Marzu from Sardinia, a pecorino deliberately infested with cheese fly larvae that break down the fats and produce a soft, pungent, almost liquid center. The EU banned the sale of Casu Marzu in 1992 on the grounds that it contained live insect larvae. Sardinian families in America never made Casu Marzu at home in large numbers, but the tradition of pushing cheese past the point where most cultures would throw it away existed in many Italian-American households. A grandmother would keep a wheel of pecorino in the cellar long after mold covered every surface, scraping it, turning it, waiting until the inside reached a texture and smell that would send a health inspector running. Then she would serve it with bread and honey and call it Sunday lunch. The line between aged and rotten is a cultural one. Italian grandmothers drew that line in a different place than the government. The cheese did not care either way. Number 9. Frittura di fiori di zucca, fried zucchini blossoms. The flowers themselves were never banned, but the method of harvesting them from public land and roadsides was restricted under the same foraging regulations that affected wild fennel. In parts of Lazio and Campania, zucchini blossoms were considered a commons crop, something anyone could pick from the edges of a field or a ditch. A woman in the Bronx in 1948 would walk to an empty lot near the Grand Concourse, pick zucchini blossoms from a patch of volunteer plants, bring them home in her apron, stuff them with ricotta and anchovy, and fry them in a batter made from flour and water. The entire dish cost nothing except the oil. Her grandchildren buy zucchini blossoms at the farmer's market for $4 each. They taste the same, but the walk to the empty lot, the apron full of flowers, the kitchen that smells like hot oil in summer, that part is gone. Number 8. Insaccati di maiale fatti in casa, homemade pork sausages. Specifically the uncured, heavily spiced fresh sausages made during the annual pig slaughter that was a centerpiece of rural Italian life. Italian regulations on home butchering and unlicensed meat processing tightened throughout the 20th century. And by the 1960s, the home production of sausages without a health certificate was technically illegal in many provinces. In America, the annual sausage making was a family event that lasted an entire weekend. A basement in Bensonhurst or a garage in Hartford would be taken over by a hand-cranked grinder, a sausage stuffer, and enough pork to fill a bathtub. Uncles argued about seasoning. Children turned the crank. The fennel and red pepper went in by instinct, not by recipe. And by Sunday evening, the basement ceiling was hung with links drying in the cold winter air. The last generation to do this together is dying now. Their children buy sausage in casings at the supermarket. It is not the same meat or the same spice or the same argument about whether the fennel was too much or not enough. Third pattern break. Something happened in Italian-American families between 1965 and 1985. The grandmothers who had carried these recipes from the old country began to die. Their daughters, many of whom had watched every step of every preparation, had already started buying convenience foods. The frozen dinner, the jarred sauce, the pre-made dough. It was not laziness, it was exhaustion. These women were working, raising children, and running households without the extended family networks their mothers had relied on. The recipes were not written down because they had never needed to be. You learned by standing next to the person who knew. You learned by burning it once and getting corrected. You learned by doing it 100 times until your hands remembered what your brain could not describe in words. When the grandmothers died, the recipes did not pass to the next generation. They evaporated. A daughter might remember the taste, she might remember the smell, but she could not reproduce the dish because the knowledge had been stored in a body that no longer existed. This was not carelessness. It was grief wearing a different face. Number 7. Strutto puro per dolci, pure rendered lard for pastry. Not the hydrogenated lard sold in supermarket boxes, but the clear, white, almost odorless fat rendered slowly at home from leaf lard, the fat around a pig's kidneys. Italian regulations on rendered animal fats in unlicensed settings followed the same trajectory as every other home processing restriction. By mid-century, commercial lard had replaced home rendering in most of Italy, but in Italian-American baking, homemade leaf lard was the secret behind every flaky pie crust, every tender biscuit, every Easter bread that shattered when you pulled it apart. A grandmother who baked with homemade lard could produce pastry that a trained French chef would envy, and she did it in a kitchen the size of a closet with an oven that ran 20 degrees hot. The commercial lard sold in stores today is a different product. It has been processed, bleached and hydrogenated until it behaves like vegetable shortening. It makes adequate pastry. The homemade version made something that people drove an hour to eat. There is a difference between adequate and worth the drive. Number 6. Amaro Fatto in Casa. Homemade bitter liqueur. Every Italian family had a version. Lemon peel, gentian root, artichoke leaves, wormwood, wild herbs steeped in grain alcohol for weeks or months. Italian regulations on the private distillation and infusion of spirits were strict, and producing Amaro at home for sale was explicitly illegal. Producing it for personal use occupied a grey area that most families navigated by not talking about it. In Italian-American basements from Boston to Baltimore, glass jars of infusing herbs sat on shelves next to the wine barrels. A grandfather would pour a small glass after Sunday dinner and hand it to you without explanation. The flavor was bitter, herbal, and complex in a way that no commercial Amaro has replicated, because commercial Amaro is designed to be consistent, and the homemade version was designed to be this year's version, different from last year's, dependent on which herbs grew well and which did not. The last jar of homemade Amaro in most families was finished at a funeral. Nobody made a new batch. Number 5. Pane fratau, Sardinian flatbread layered with tomato sauce, poached egg, and pecorino. The bread itself, pane carasau, was made at home in Sardinia for centuries and subject to the same grain and bakery regulations as every other bread. But pane fratau as a complete dish was a poverty meal, something a shepherd's wife assembled from whatever was in the kitchen, and its survival depended entirely on the bread being made by hand in a wood-fired oven that no modern kitchen can replicate. The Sardinian women who brought this dish to America faced a simple problem. The ovens in American apartments could not get hot enough, and the bread came out wrong. Some adapted, most gave up. The dish that survived in Sardinia as a restaurant specialty, revived and repackaged, bears little resemblance to the version made by a woman alone in a kitchen with 3 ingredients and no recipe. Number 4. Pomodori secchi sott'olio without pasteurization. Sun-dried tomatoes packed in olive oil without heat processing. Italian food safety regulations required heat pasteurization for preserved vegetables packed in oil to prevent botulism. The regulation was medically sound. Improperly canned vegetables in oil can kill. Italian grandmothers packed their sun-dried tomatoes in olive oil in glass jars and stored them in the pantry for months. They added garlic, oregano, sometimes a dried hot pepper. The oil turned golden and fragrant. They never pasteurized anything. They never got sick. The reason they never got sick is that they used enough salt and acid in the drying process to create an environment where botulism could not grow, but they did not know the science. They knew the method. The method was older than the science. When food safety pamphlets started circulating in Italian-American communities in the 1970s, a generation of daughters read about botulism and threw out their mothers' jars. The grandmothers watched their work go into the garbage. They did not argue, they just stopped making it. Number 3. Ragu Napolitano cooked for 8 hours. Neapolitan meat sauce. Not a quick simmer with ground beef, but a slow-cooked sauce built from whole cuts of pork, beef, and sometimes veal, braised in tomato for 6 to 8 hours until the meat dissolved and the sauce turned dark and thick. The dish itself was legal, but the cuts of meat used, specifically the cheapest, toughest, most ignored cuts from the butcher, were increasingly regulated in Italy under grading and labeling laws that pushed ungraded cuts out of commercial circulation. In Italian-American kitchens, the sauce started at dawn. A mother would brown the meat in a heavy pot, then add tomatoes and lower the heat to barely a whisper. The pot would sit on the stove all morning and into the afternoon. The apartment would smell like Sunday. Children would be told not to lift the lid. Fathers would try to steal a piece of bread dipped in the sauce and get their hands slapped. The sauce consumed an entire day. It demanded attention, patience, and a willingness to stand in a hot kitchen for hours, doing nothing visible. When both parents started working full-time, the 8-hour sauce was the first thing to go. A jar of ragu from the supermarket cost 89 cents. The homemade version cost a day of someone's life. The price was never about money. Number 2. Torta di ricotta without a recipe. Not a specific dish, but a category. Every Italian-American grandmother had a ricotta cake or pie that she made without measuring anything. Ricotta, eggs, sugar, a little flour, lemon zest, maybe some chocolate or candied orange peel. The proportions lived in her hands. She knew when the batter looked right, felt right, smelled right. She poured it into a crust she had made from lard and flour without a recipe either. This was never illegal, but it was, in a regulatory sense, unclassifiable. No recipe meant no standardization. No standardization meant no one could replicate it. And because Italian food purity laws required labeled and measured ingredients for anything sold commercially, a cake made by feel and instinct could never be a product. It could only be a gift. When the grandmother died, the cake died. A daughter might try to recreate it from memory. She would get close, but close is not the same. Close is the gap between watching someone do something 1,000 times and being able to do it once yourself without guidance. The last time most families tasted the real version was at a table where the woman who made it was still alive. After that, the memory of the taste outlived the taste itself. Number 1. La cucina della nonna. Grandmother's kitchen. This is not a recipe. This is all of them. The reason every dish on this list disappeared is the same reason. The kitchen itself disappeared. The physical room where a woman stood for 50 years, cooking from memory, correcting by taste, teaching by proximity, adjusting by season. That room is gone. It was not a restaurant. It was not a cooking show. It had no measurements, no timers, no written instructions. It ran on instinct built from repetition, on hands that remembered what mouths had taught them, on a relationship between a woman and her ingredients that no cookbook has ever captured and no regulation could ever classify. The Italian government tried to standardize food. It succeeded. American convenience tried to replace the kitchen. It succeeded. Time tried to erase the women who stood in those kitchens. It succeeded, but something remains. Not the recipes exactly, not the precise measurements, because there never were precise measurements. What remains is the memory of a table set for too many people, the sound of a spoon against the side of a pot, the way a grandmother's hands moved without hesitation through flour and egg and salt. That is what Sunday was, not a day, a transmission. And if you are watching this and you remember a kitchen like that, the question is not whether you can recreate the recipes. The question is whether you tried, whether you stood next to her even once and watched, whether you asked. And if you did not ask, the question becomes something harder. Not what was lost, but what you would give to stand in that kitchen one more time and pay attention. I want to know. Which dish on this list did your grandmother make? Which one disappeared from your family's table? And if you still have even one of these recipes written or remembered, tell me in the comments, because every recipe that someone remembers is one that has not disappeared yet. My money is on the ricotta cake. It always was.